Hi everybody, welcome to, well, another video. So what we're going to have a look at today, I've been asked by quite a few people to do some more basic videos. You know, people that are new to spraying, they come across the channel and they want something that's a bit more of an introduction. So I'm going to try and do a few videos that are just, you know, running through different things, maybe 4 or 5 different ones. This is going to be the first one. What we're going to look at, we're going to look at the spray gun, the controls of the spray gun, what they do, try and get an idea of what viscosity means. This is a viscosity cup for those that don't know. And then the more important part of the video, I think anyway, is we're gonna do a few pattern tests, but we're gonna show the effect that different viscosity will have on the pattern, as well as the settings of the gun and of course the air pressure. So that's the idea of the video anyway. So hopefully we can make it as interesting as we can. One of the things I will say about these various spray guns, and I've said this before as well, it's all fair and well buying really good spray guns, but the quality of the air that comes in is very important. If you've got moisture or oil particles, or normally a mixture of both, coming from your compressor through the airline, doesn't matter how good your spray gun is, how good your technique is, how good your materials are, you're not going to get good results, because you're going to get little fish eyes and things like that because of the rubbish that's coming through the line. So I've done a few separate videos on that, and I'll put links in the description to those. Also regulators, we'll run through quickly why you use a regulator. In a minute we'll go through that, but I've done a separate one on regulators as well, so we won't go into regulators. I'll just again put a link in the description so that you can know a little bit more about regulators. So let's get on and start then, I guess. So this is what's called a FOREVERT 4 cup, or a DIN 4 cup, and all that means is it's got a 4mm hole in the bottom of it, and the cup holds a certain amount of liquid. So what you do is you fill, whatever you're trying to spray, you fill up to the top and you wait to see how long it takes for it to go through. Now heating the clear coat up also has an effect on the viscosity, and again there'll be lots of links in the description. I'll put a link in the description to a video I did of cold clear coat and warm clear coat, just to see the difference of viscosity using this very cup. But when you look at a technical data sheet, and I would always suggest that you look at the technical data sheet of whatever you're going to spray, you know, whatever material you're going to spray, it will normally give you a suggested viscosity, and that will be through one of these. Industry standard for years, it will normally say DIN 4 18 seconds or DIN 4 16 seconds. Might say FOREVERT 4 18 seconds or whatever, but it will be the same as this. These things are about, I don't know, 10 11 quid, something like that in the UK. They're not particularly expensive, worth having, because if you're new to spraying, getting your viscosity right will help you get better results. So that's covering viscosities. Now we said we'd look at the various controls on the spray gun. Now some manufacturers use slightly different controls than others. I've got here an ANI gun, reasonable quality gun. The reason I've got this one out is because it has the fan adjuster on the side. Now makes like SATA, Porpish and some other guns have the fan adjustment on the side. A lot of them will have the fan adjustment on the back. Now this is a DeVilbiss gun, and this is the fan adjustment on the back. Now obviously the fan adjustment is quite self-explanatory. One way you'll get the biggest fan, and by that I mean the biggest width of fan possible, obviously bringing the gun away from the work, so you know a further distance will increase that fan. But it also can take away sometimes from the atomization, because you're increasing that distance. The droplets tend to slow down, and they tend to fall rather than hit. That's what I find anyway. So that's a thing to look out for, the different adjustments. But one is effectively all the way in is a spot, so it's just a round spot. That will obviously vary like an airbrush from the distance you hold it away from the work. and the full fan is, as I say, the biggest fan. Now, some guns, this one for example, doesn't really have much in between. Obviously it does have it in between, but it's only a small amount of adjustment that takes it from spot to full fan, whereas something like this De Vilbiss has a bit more, you know, you need to turn it a little bit more to get the same distance. I always find that when you start to close the fan up on a gun, the pattern suffers slightly and the atomization suffers slightly. And I guess that's going to be why they make, you know, a 1.0 millimeter, a 0.8, 0.5, 1.4, whatever. Because it is better to use these things on full fan. I always find that, and that's why they do make so many different guns, because otherwise in theory you could turn this gun down and get yourself a nice small fan, relatively small fan, and why would you need a minigun? Obviously you've got the form factor of the bigger gun in that it's physically bigger, but it does definitely, I think, work better having the fan open. For it's not for all guns. There are a few guns, the WS400 Iwata for example, the Series 1, the clear gun, it doesn't spray properly with it all the way out. You need to turn the fan in, but that's getting a bit more involved than we need to here really. So that's your fan control. It can be on the side of the gun, it can be a wheel here. Some of the advantages of the wheel just here, which is about here normally, is that you can sometimes adjust them with your thumb if you need to. I don't find I need to adjust the fan that much during painting. I will set it up at the start. As I say, normally I'll have it on full fan, and I tend not to touch it. But I appreciate people doing things like wheels and that, where you've got a bigger area, you cover that, and then you might just wind it in to get the smaller area on the inside of the spokes, for want of a better word. So that's one of the advantages if you would tend to use it. As I say, most people don't normally, not in full flight. With something like this, you've got no hope of reaching that, so you just turn it with your hands. Again, with it on the back of the gun, you can actually get to it with your thumb. As you can see there, you can get to it, but again, I tend not to. So the next one is your fluid. Now the fluid is always at the back of the needle. So your needle goes through here. You have the needle, you can see the needle there, and it's just purely pulling the needle back. So what it does, the fluid comes through the passage at the top. These are gravity fed. So when you pull the trigger back, you're letting air through the gun, and what that does is that physically lets air through the cap. Now that air through the cap draws the fluid through. The fluid isn't pushed from the back, it's drawn from the front. So by increasing your airflow, you can often bring more fluid through the same size tip. You get various size tips. We run through tip sizes just quickly. This is a 1.3, and it's just the size of the opening in the front of the hole there. All these air holes around here will vary on different makes of gun, but it's the one in the centre that normally you will get a measurement for. And that also will be on your technical data sheet. So you might have something that says 1.4 to 1.6. So the tip size I recommend is obviously 1.4 to 1.6. Now you can get your material through a 1.3. If it says 1.4, you should be able to get it through a 1.3, but you might have to make it slightly thinner, which again comes to our viscosity cup. So if it says 18 seconds for a 1.4, if you thin the material out and you get it coming through at, what, if it takes 16 seconds for the whole lot to go through, then that means the material is thinner. So it should then go through a 1.3. That's the idea of that. So obviously the longer it takes for the material to go through here, the thicker it is. So that's the idea of the tip sizes, etc. It's just for different materials, and it's a guide more than a must do. It's a guide. If you over thin materials, so as I was saying before, say this is a 1.1, they do make a 1.1 version. If this was a 1.1 and your technical data sheet said 1.6, you could in theory thin it out to go nicely through a 1.1. But if you over thin the material, so primer or base coat or whatever you're using, if you over thin it, you'll find that you can get dieback later, and by that I mean it starts to crack because there's so much thinners in it, which obviously ultimately just disperses into the air, it just evaporates. It can leave little cracks in your work, and you might only notice that the following day. or a bit longer down the road than that. So it's not good to over thin material, although you will get away with being able to thin it to a certain degree. I said we'd just touch on regulators. I've done a separate video on regulators. I would recommend a diaphragm regulator to anybody. This is a diaphragm regulator. It doesn't have to be huge. But what I said at the start of the video about the quality of the air, another thing, and the video about regulators will go into this, particularly the second half of it. But another thing you need to look out for is a constant pressure of air. If you have your compressor set to 120 psi, something like that, and you're running the gun on 29 psi, what you will find is as that compressor winds down, even if it kicks in to start up again, if your gun is using more than that compressor is pushing out, which it can do for a certain amount of time because you've got your holding tank as a reservoir, you will find that the pressure will slowly drop and you will have to keep adjusting it. And one of the things that you will notice when we do the pattern testing is the effect that the pressure can have on the pattern. And getting a good, even, consistent pattern all the time is really key to getting good results. If you can get a good steady flow of air, clean air, you will get you've got real good odds in your favour of getting good results. As I said at the start, you can have the best gun in the world, but if you've got rubbish air and it's coming through at varying pressures, you're still going to find it a bit of a struggle. So regulators. Now people use regulators for a few different things. As I've just said, a diaphragm regulator is good because it helps steady the air supply. Even if you've got a diaphragm, even if you've got a diaphragm further along your line, and again other videos will explain more about that. I tend to use two regulators, basically one at the gun and one further down the line, and they're both diaphragm regulators, so they make the air delivery nice and smooth. But if you're the reason for a regulator is for you to be able to adjust the pressure at the gun. Now most manufacturers will have a way of adjusting the pressure at the gun. So this is it here. It's got a little nought there, which you can see there. So if you put that across to there, you'll get nothing coming out of the gun. You hook it up to the air supply and you get nothing coming out of the gun. When you turn it the other way, that's maximum pressure. So that's the maximum pressure that can go through the gun, which is obviously regulated or dictated by the pressure going in at the bottom of the gun. So if you've got 2 bar or 29 psi going in at the bottom of the gun, there's no way you'll be able to get more than 2 bar 29 psi coming out the front. In fact, you get less because the holes that are in the air cap are reducing that pressure. Manufacturers will often list the pressure at the base of the gun, particularly Japanese manufacturers, at the base of the gun, but they'll also give you an air pressure that equates to at the air cap. So you're not dealing with 2 bar or 29 psi at the cap, you're dealing with that at the base. So the idea of a regulator is to regulate the pressure at the base of the gun. Now, to get that to give you the correct reading, get the regulator to give you the correct reading, you always need the onboard control of the gun fully open. So it can't be on naught, it needs to be on full. And it's the same with all of these. This one is one at the bottom of the gun. Out like that is fully open, in like that is fully closed. So you need that fully open, and effectively you just leave that fully open. And then you do all the work on your regulator, which is at the bottom of the gun. Now there are a couple of exceptions. Some of the cheaper guns, this is another ANI, little GF3, good little gun. But to cut back, you'll see there's a screw. Now this is effectively the same body as the R150 or the compact, which is another version of it, just with bigger tips that's come out. And this gives you a look at how a manufacturer can use the same body but make a gun cheaper. And ANI do it in a few of their guns, and there's a few other makes that do it as well. And what they've done is the finish of the body, it's just come out the casting and it's not finished to such a high standard as the better quality gun. But what they've also done is the gap that's there, normally in there you get the onboard air control. So it will be the same as this, just smaller version, exactly the same as that. And obviously there it's missing. And the reason it's missing is because they don't have to supply it. So it makes the gun cheaper. So they're trying to keep the cost of the gun down, which is great because it means that it's more accessible to more people without having to spend the money. But what it also means is that if you don't use a regulator, you've got no way at the gun or around the gun, bear in mind the regulator is normally at the bottom, of controlling the air pressure. So a control valve or a cheater valve, regulator, whatever you want to call it, at the bottom of the gun makes perfect sense on something, on a cheaper gun, because it hasn't got to, can't even put that on there. It hasn't got, that's quite awkward. It hasn't got to be able to, there's one of these it really doesn't like, and I think this is actually it. So this thing doesn't want to go on there, and there's a reason for that, and this is the only gun it doesn't go on. If you look at the, it's going to make the video a bit longer, but we'll go for it anyway. If you look at the end there on the ANI, see this bit here with no thread? If you look at that, which again is an ANI, you see there isn't that no thread zone. It's about I don't know, 4 mil, something like that. And what it means is that some of these regulators will not fit on the GF3 because they have a very short throw between this part here which seals and the amount of thread, and there's just not enough thread to get it started. So let's get a ANI regulator and we'll put that on there. The ANI has much more of a lead, so you can see, but that's the regulator on there, and that will be your only way of adjusting the air supply on the gun, because it's completely missing. And there's a few guns like that, a few of the cheaper guns like that, but most of them will have their onboard supply, their onboard regulator already there, as I say, either on the top there, or most of them are at the bottom of the gun here. So always when you're using a regulator with the gun, with the onboard regulator, make sure that's fully open so that you get the correct reading at the regulator. So what we do now is I'll stick a camera on my head and we just run through a few patterns, and we try two bits of material, one at a 18-second viscosity, and the other one's just going to be pure thinners. So it will probably run through that cup in about, I don't know, I might try it actually, but it's going to be about, I don't know, 8 seconds, something like that, to just run through it. So it's much thinner, and you'll see what the effect is. And we'll also use a few different pressures. We're not going to spray. I will do another video with spraying. We'll try different pressures, but just to see the effect it has on the pattern, because getting a good consistent pattern is one of the secrets to getting, you know, good spray jobs. So we'll stick the camera on my head and we'll get going. So one part of the gun we haven't looked at yet is the fluid adjustment. So this is a simple control, and it's effectively an interference fit with a needle. So inside the gun, just here, this is actually a SATA one, but it's the same thing. You have the needle, and by turning this back, it allows the needle to travel further back. That's all it is just interference here. The more you turn this back out, the more it allows that needle back. Now at the front of the gun you have a tip. Again, this is a SATA, but it's the same thing. You have the tip in there. So by pulling that needle back, you see this here is a taper fit. Hopefully you can see that's a taper fit. And there's also a taper in there, which you won't be able to see. But by pulling this back, you're effectively increasing the gap between this taper and the taper in here. So you're increasing the size of the gap, which is just allowing more material to come through. Remember what I said at the front, or at the start of the video, it's actually pulled through. It's not pushed, it's pulled. Although you've got gravity which brings it down into the chamber here, it's actually the air coming through those air horns that create like a vortex effect, and it pulls it through, pulls the material through. So that's all you're doing, adjusting the paint flow, is changing this gap between the gap in the tip and the taper on the needle. So when you adjust your fluid like this, that is all you're doing, is allowing that needle back. Now if you go all the way in, you will obviously get no material flow at all. We're getting air but no material, and then obviously as you ease it back, you'll get more and more material start to come through, but you will reach a limit, and that limit is when you pull the trigger in. I'll do it like that. When you pull the trigger in, hold that there, and you adjust this back, you'll see the trigger, well you probably won't, but the trigger is slowly moving. See the material dropping out? So it slowly allows the trigger back, and it will go to a certain distance and then it will not go back any further. The trigger will not go back any further, but this will stay coming out. Once you've reached the trigger not going back any further, don't matter how much you turn it out anymore, you won't get any more material. So when you hear me say 2.5 turns out, or I often say 2.5 turns out on settings, it's this all the way in, and then just literally, this has actually got a little counter on it, just literally 1, 2.5 out. So you know that that is 2.5 out. When you push that back, it will come 2.5 turns out and then stop because of that interference fit. And remember that with the trigger, you can actually guide that with your finger. I won't do it at the moment because we'll have fluid dropping out, but you can guide that with your finger, and by that I mean you can pull that in only a small amount, so you're not actually coming against the stop, but that will come with practice. And it's certainly, I find it easier to actually set this to the setting that you want and just pull the trigger rather than feather the trigger, but certainly feathering it is something you can do. So what we're going to do now, we're just going to look at the effect that air pressure can have on the pattern. Now I'm going to set this to 2 bar, which is what this is normally run at, 2 bar. I'll put it on full fluid, so we've got the fluid fully coming out. It's on full fan. As I said to you before, most of this spraying will be done on full fan. So we're at the pressure and the settings. I would normally use this for clear coat. This has got a clear coat in it, actually mixed with thinners rather than hardener, and that's to give me time. It won't go off in the gun because I'm standing here talking to you rather than actually spraying something. But it's a viscosity of 18 seconds through the forward cup. And I did try some thinners, which we will try through the gun a bit later, and that took 9 seconds to go through the forward cup. So our guess, or my guess, of 8 seconds wasn't that bad at all. So we've got the gun set on the settings we would normally use it on, and we'll just have a look at the pattern, and we should get a nice even pattern. Now distance, let me get the water spanner. Now the distance will vary depending what you want, but I'm going to do it an eye water spanner so that we're talking the same distance all the time. But that is about 7 inches. So we'll try that. And as you can see, we've got a nice lengthy pattern. I'm not going to worry about the length of the pattern in this video because different guns and different caps will have different patterns. We're just going to look on the effect of changing the pressure has on the pattern with the different viscosity of the material. So that pattern is absolutely fine. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to try and turn the pressure up a bit, because often people say that if you want to get, and we'll go through that in a different video, but if you want to get a flatter finish, you can increase the pressure. But if you increase the pressure too much, what will happen, well, I'm hoping will happen anyway. So we now got it at 3.5 bar, which is, what's that when it's at home, about 40 psi, 45 psi, no, 50 psi. And we'll try at the same distance. Now I think the pattern may separate. Now it's not too bad, but it's starting to get, if you can see, we got a bigger pattern because of the amount of force coming out. Remember I said the more pressure you get, the more material normally it will draw through. But if you look at it now, hopefully you can see that it's actually thicker at the top, thicker at the bottom, and thinner in the middle. Now if the Viscositys material was less, and we'll try it with some thinners soon, you will find that even more pronounced. You will have nearly all your material at the top, all your material at the bottom, and hardly anything in between. And if you haven't got a good solid pattern like that, when you start lapping left and right and allow your normal overlap, might be 50-60% on your work, you will find that you will start to get, if it's base coat and things like that, tiger stripes and the like. But what you will not get is an even, consistent pattern. So we're going to try it just a little bit more to get it to separate. I'll put it now up to 4.5 bar, more than you would use it on, but we'll see if it does make it separate, because I'm convinced it will. Again, now we're getting a very distinct top, bottom and middle, and you see we've got a dry patch there, or drier patch there, and a drier patch there. Now if we take the pressure the other way, so we go down, we will hold on to our pattern, but we will lose our atomization. The atomization won't be on so fine, and what you will get is you will end up getting little spits. So we'll try that, try to keep our distance the same. Now, see, we've still got a reasonable pattern, although the pattern is starting to get wider, and you will lose your atomization. It's not a bad pattern, but it's not the traditional pattern that the T110 cap. This is a T110 cap. Will normally give you like a more of an eye pattern, and we'll bring that down again, and we should see the same happening, but even worse. So you see now we're getting a smaller pattern, and it's still wetter. Now some spray guns will give you that pattern anyway, but I can assure you when you actually use this on a panel, and we'll do that in a different video, you will see that the atomization isn't particularly fine. You can see these wet edges here, which are actually bigger than that one's actually going to be a dry edge because there's so much pressure. But you can see it actually gets wetter around the edges, and that's because the particles aren't so fine, and that's because the pressure just isn't there to give it. So what we do now is I'll swap over to a thinner viscosity, and you should see some marked difference to these patterns. Now the material that we had here has been thinned out to about 12 seconds through a forward cut, so a fair bit thinner than the material we used here. Now we're going to try it at 2 bar, and I think you'll find the separation will be quite noticeable, top and bottom patterns, but we'll see. Again, full fan, full fluid, settings the same. You see noticeable separation, more at the top than the bottom. That's just the way the gun's designed. The air comes in one end, and it's actually, there's a baffle that actually sends it around. If the material's so thin, you get it coming out top heavy. Some guns are bottom heavy, depends how they're made. But there's no fault with the gun at all. That's just purely the viscosity of the material has changed. Bear in mind, this is thinner than the material we used here. So this fan here is absolutely fine, and that was exactly the same settings as we've used here, and you can see the result is completely different. So when you get a new gun and you put thinners in it and you try it at the pressure that's recommended, and you get this separation, it's not the gun, it's the material. The material is too thin. So what you need to do now in a situation like that, if you're spraying material like that, you need to lower the pressure, and that will bring that pattern back in. So let's take it down to 1.5 bar, so about 20 psi, 21 psi, and see what difference that makes. There, now that's given us still top heavy, but it's given us a much more even pattern. But we still know that if we want a good pattern, we need to bring that pressure down a bit more. Now this is where a good gun comes in handy, because when you start to lower the pressure on cheaper guns, you don't get such good results normally, whereas the more expensive guns tend to keep their pattern. Not always the case, but generally is. So we're going to lower this now to about 1.1, 1.2 bar. There we are, and see what sort of pattern we get. There, so we've got a pattern now that's more or less the same as that. It's still slightly top heavy. Bear in mind the material is thinner, so we tend to get more material out because it flows quicker out the gun. But you can see we're getting the pattern now nicely. The pattern is coming along much more like this one, and it's purely because of the viscosity of the material that we've had to adjust that gun. Now you can do things like bring the fan in, so let's bring the fan in a bit. Now when you bring the fan in, you will notice the pressure change. So if you look at that, let's take the fan out. So that's just 1.1 bar, about 16 psi. If we bring that fan in, bring it all the way just to extreme, you should see that when we pull the trigger, that will show a higher pressure, and that's because basically you've shut some of the fan off, so you're giving a bit of resistance to the air coming in. There, so that's about 1.3 bar now. So the setting is exactly the same, it's just the fan has gone in. But if we take this fan out a bit, we should be able to get a bit more pressure through there by closing this fan. Now we'll get a smaller pattern, but we should keep a consistent pattern, which is what we're trying to do. Now you see we've upped the pressure, but we've got a more acceptable consistent pattern. Still a little bit top heavy, nothing to do with the gun, we know that because the gun is absolutely fine there, but it's a much better pattern. So by bringing the fan in a little bit, you can compensate for your gun shortfallings or the material shortfallings and the reason you can do that is because you've got a good pattern. So if we bring that pattern in a little bit more, and this is what I was saying about the adjustment on the ANI, there's only a small amount of adjustment between big and small, and we'll try and up that pressure just a little bit more and see if we can just keep on that pattern, see if we can keep that pattern reasonable, which we can. It's still a little bit top heavy, as I said, but we've still got a reasonable pattern. So we're now using the same material that we were spraying here at 2 bar, and then we went down to 1.4 bar I think, or 1.2 bar, and we went down, and now we've gone up again, and that's because we've closed our fan in a little bit. So we're now up, what did we do here? We went 1.1 bar, didn't we? So we're at 1.5, 1.6 bar now, and we're getting this sort of pattern. So we're getting the same pattern more or less as we got with 1.1 bar, but we're going to have finer atomization because we've got 1.5 bar going through it. And that's what you need to do. You need to practice your patterns to get a good pattern with the material you're using. Obviously it's always possible to make materials thinner, and as I said before, there's a few problems that you can get doing that, but it's not always possible to make materials thicker. If it's base coats, you can buy a base coat that needs thinning down and not thin it so much, etc, etc. But it was really difficult to try and think of how I would explain to you guys what I see and feel every day. But hopefully you're getting an idea of how to use a spray gun. And next time what we do is I'll get a panel out, we'll section it into different sections, and we'll see what the effect of these different pressures have with a normal clear coat, and see what sort of finish we get. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry it's so long. Cheers. Bye bye.